So this live session is being recorded and it will be shared on social media, and I can send you the link when it has been published on YouTube. Speaking of which, the link to the YouTube and other pieces of information where you can find out more about Chandrima and my work has just been put into the chat window. So please check that out. If you enjoy these sessions or have someone that you would like to see here with Chandrima or with me, please leave a comment on the YouTube channel and please subscribe if you would like to encourage me to do more. Before we get started, okay, I got some house rules. Please keep your mics muted throughout the session so that we don't get feedback from the audio and there's no disruption. If you'd like to ask a question, it'll be super if you could include your name and country just so we know who you are and where you're from. Chandrima and I will chat for about 30 to 40 minutes, and the last 20 minutes will just be for you and your questions. So that being said, we are happy to answer your questions anytime during the hour. So please, if something comes to your mind, feel free to put it into the chat window. Okay, so I'm very happy to have Chandrima with me today. As mentioned earlier,
thank you, Debbie.
Ecologist, single mom, and storyteller. She completed her master's at the Wildlife Institute of India and then joined the Ashoka Trust for research in ecology and the environment for her doctoral candidacy. Right now, Chandrima is a grants advisor at DBT Wellcome Trust Alliance, which is a funding organization in India. Chandrima's thesis involved understanding the variety of relationships that are shared between domestic dogs, the environment, and people in the high reaches, cold desert landscapes of India. During Chandrima's PhD fieldwork, she traversed the high Himalaya, 4,200 meters above sea level, with her beautiful daughter in tow, a story that we're all dying to hear more about in just a moment. Don't forget to connect with Chandrima and I. We are on Twitter. Again, those details in the chat window, so please check that out. Chandrima, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Fantastic. I have so many questions. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. I understand you had to take some time off of work, so thank you. Thank you very much. We hope that stays together for us. You have such an exciting story. So I'm just going to start at the beginning because all of it is so exciting. So the only way I know how to do this is just like, you know, along a timeline. When you were growing up, you shared with me, you grew up as a little girl in Kolkata, and you shared that you were inspired by the stories of the natural world told to you by your grand uncle who had come to live with you. So I'm super curious, what kind of stories were shared with you? Could you share some with us, and how did these stories inspire you?
So thanks. So this goes a long way to my childhood. I grew up I was born in Calcutta, then I was in North Bengal for 2-3 years, and then I came back living in Calcutta, and I was superbly bored as a kid because the northern part of Bengal, it was very, very different from a city where I was like, you know, you had everything, all the traffic and everything around. I couldn't roam around the way I was used to doing it when I was a kid in that place. So, and at that point of time, my grand uncle from Meghalaya, he happened to join us. So he is a Khasi. He was a Khasi, and he kind of adopted himself in our family, my paternal grandmother's family. And he lived with us. He was born during the time when the last pandemic happened in 1918. And he kind of, he lived in Shillong for 70 years. He was a hunter turned farmer. In the latter part of his years, he was running a farm in a place called Umran, which is very close to the Shillong city. And he was growing his vegetables, he was raising livestock and poultry. And then finally, at the end of that, he couldn't sustain himself and he had to come back to Calcutta. And that's how he came to live with us. And I have grown up listening to his stories from the Northeast. Being a hunter, he was often in the forests hunting for wild animals, and you know, all the stories that were associated with the general life of Khasi people was something that I imbibed from a very young age. So one of the stories that he had told me was his story where he kind of gave up hunting. And that was, once he was in the forest and with his bow and arrow, and he hunted down an animal. And when he happened to look at the animal and open the mouth, he saw that the animal had no teeth. And he kind of went into a paroxysm of tears, and he kind of told himself that I've killed an animal which does not even have teeth to protect me. And what have I done? And then I kept on, budging him, asking him, what is the animal that you killed? And he was like, I don't know, but it had scales like a fish. So I went and I got hold of an encyclopedia, and I was going through the pages, and he pointed to a pangolin. So the pangolin was his last hunt. And if you look at how the pangolin looks, like when it is threatened, it rolls into a ball, and it's got scales like the fish. And it doesn't really have teeth. It has a long tongue with which it catches insects and ants and things like that. So I think that was one of the stories which really, inspired me. And he has told me several stories of how he's encountered a leopard. He's encountered, a cheetal being killed by other animals, and how people catch termites when they fly out in the rain, and they kind of air dry it and cook it with rice and eat it. And
Okay,
it's like
so how do they catch termites from the air?
So basically they would have these piece of cloth, and when the termites emerged from the soil, they would just, like a net, they would just catch it and put it in a vessel where they would dry roast these termites and have them with rice. So these were the kind of stories I grew up with. So I kind of got attracted to, the forests of the Northeast, and, how things were at that point of time. And that's something that really inspired me.
What I really love about the way that you've just told, you've just related the experience that your granduncle shared with you. It sounds to me as if you were there. The way you've described it is so vivid that I imagine that was how much of an impact those stories had on you, that you sort of experienced it too, even though you were not there yourself. So it's just remarkable to hear those stories from you being told like that. And
so I must have heard this story like 1,000 times, because I would keep on badgering him to tell me these stories again and again and again. Tell me this story, tell me that story. And that's how it all started. So each of the stories that he had narrated to me has been narrated over those many years, that many times. So it's almost like in my head, and they're still there, and I don't forget them.
It also feels like, so one of the things as you were telling the stories, I could actually sort of feel it. I could feel like my skin, like when you're describing the animal and how it was just lying there, and he was really sad watching the animal and reflecting on what he had just done. It was multi-sensory as you were just relating it in words to me. So I can imagine how much of an impact that would have had on you as a little girl. And it's very similar to a part of my childhood as well. I actually grew up in a village in Singapore. I lived there until I was 8 years. And actually at that time, Singapore was going through a transition period where many of the people who were living in villages, so like my grandmother had a village home. We had a huge fig tree at the back. It was flooded all the time in the monsoon rains, full of mud. We had pythons on the porch, scorpions that were like that big on the bed. They were a very normal part of our daily life. And I remember how much when I moved to an apartment in the city. So Singapore was in transition. They were getting rid of the rural villages, moving everyone into apartments. How it was so devoid of stimuli. And so like now when people ask me to recollect what it was like for me when I was 8 years old growing up in the city during that time, I actually have very little memory of what I experienced in the apartment. And a lot of the memories that I have are from photographs, like looking at photographs like, oh, I did that, I had that, I was there. But if you ask me to remember it, any experiences and emotion connected to that place, I can't really tell you. So going back to your story, so we have animals, empathy, and how did all of that lead to science?
So I think the fact that I was always drawn to nature and animal life was there from the very beginning. Like heard about these stories from my childhood. Over a period of time, I think biology as a subject was something which I really enjoyed, and I was very curious. I'm still curious now. I asked a lot of questions. I still do that, and I think those were the kind of things that kind of pushed me into doing science. When I was in my undergrads, I happened to, and I went into a very basic degree in zoology. I did not want to become an MBBS doctor or an engineer. I just wanted to study animals. So I went into a basic degree in zoology. And in my second year of my undergrad degree, I happened to go for a field trip in, in Corbett National Park, which is in the Shivalik Hills. And I think that trip was it kind of changed my life and my perspective forever, because post that I actually I was looking out for opportunities to study ecology as a subject in India. And that's how I came upon the master's course in Wildlife Institute of India. And I decided that I would want to apply for this course. And that's how I landed up with my master's there. But the transition to this, a big transition happened, particularly during my undergrads, when I was trying to figure out what next. Okay, I love animals. I'm studying zoology for that. But what next? So I think that's how it happened. And another thing is, I think as a family also, I have a very illustrative family. So my another uncle of mine is an ornithologist. And he had written the first bird book in Bengali, which was published really long time ago, much before Kresmizak and Grimmett and Inskip came in. And this was about the birds of Bengal. And he happened to roam the forests with Dr. Salim Ali as well. So I think the genes were there. And along with that, a lot of other experiences kind of pushed me into this field.
So from your undergrad to your master's and to your PhD, you have worked with a variety of Indian animals, right? So we've had, was it Indian foxes?
Indian foxes.
Indian foxes, yes. Desert gerbils. That's
yes.
Really, I mean, like, it must be hard to find them. You said you buried them. And then most recently, dogs, right? So lots of animals, varied geography, different types of communities, peoples, culture, backgrounds. Have you identified any common threads that run through all of these systems?
So I would like to keep the dogs out a bit, because technically they don't fall within the category of wild animals. But if I look at the kind of habitats in which I have worked, primarily I have worked in the hot deserts in India, in the Kutch, in the western part of India. And finally, for my PhD, I worked in the cold deserts, cold desert landscapes in India. One very basic common thread that I have seen, irrespective of habitat, species, especially about the people, is that they are very simple. They are used to being in harsh climates. They endure a lot, and therefore their perspective to life is very different from us. That is a common thread in the dry deserts, and they are very welcoming. You come from, when you're living in a city, you're always very worried about who is coming to your house. Who are these people? How are they as people? You don't see that in these places. Like even in these desert landscapes, semi-arid landscapes, you just land up in the home of a local community, of a person in the house, and they will welcome you with equal, enjoyment. And it's the same with the people also in the Himalayas, in the Spiti landscape where I work, where I think the people are very simple. They're very different from the way we see people in cities. That is one. Second thing, in terms of the habitats, a lot of these habitats, especially the semi-arid habitats, they are considered as wastelands in our country. Yeah, but they are not. They are not. A lot of this diversity that you see of foxes, of gerbils, and many other kind of species, wolves, jackals, all these animals roam these forests. they are a part of that landscape. And unfortunately, over a period of time, many of these habitats are going off for larger industrial changes in the form of, say, like renewable energies, large solar fields, a lot of the landscape going off for building these huge solar panels for harnessing solar energy. A lot of these landscapes are going off. So that is a common thread across many of these species that share these landscapes. In terms of the species themselves, I think another common thread which I have seen is that most of these species that I have studied till now, except the dog, uh, is the fact that they have not been given importance in terms of their ecology. There are very few studies that have actually kind of looked into this. So those were the kind of common threads I can see within this. So you won't have too many studies that have looked at gerbils in India. You won't have too many studies that have looked at jungle cats or even Indian foxes. There are very few studies on Indian foxes in India.
Yeah, I think that really underscores how anthropocentric, when we think about, is a land productive, is it useful, even when we come to looking at the ecosystem processes and services, it's very human centric. How does it benefit people? And quite in contrast to what you were sharing with me earlier about how your grand uncle had taught you to perceive animals, was to actually, there was sort of a sense of reverence, seeing them as other beings that had their own space, as you were saying. And yeah, I mean, it's fantastic that you managed to actually draw some similarities from what would otherwise appear as very high contrast environments. You mentioned this, that those landscapes are still perceived as wastelands. Could you go a little bit more into that for us? What is the status now of how people are trying to push back from that, or mitigate impact of all the developments that you just spoke about in those wastelands, which is a horrible word, but yeah, desert landscapes.
Desert landscapes. So I think the problem is that that these kind of discourses go back to many years about how people viewed desert landscapes. That is one. People view desert landscape as treeless or without trees, treeless landscapes, and the fact that you need to green a place, you need to change the place, you need to plant trees, you need to make it look like a forest. These were the kind of common discourses that ran for a very long period of time. And many of these areas, especially in the western parts of India, many of these areas, because of the way people have thought about them, like thought of greening a desert, has actually changed these landscapes. So if you look at, say, like a species like Prosopis juliflora, which is basically a tree from Mexico, it came to India as a part of a initiative to green the desert. So apparently in the late 1970s, seeds were airdropped in the western parts of the landscape. And now it's a massive invasive species. And it has completely changed the kind of systems there also. So it's similar with many other invasive species as well, like species that are used for greening deserts. Prosopis is only one of the examples. So these are the kind of underlying discourses that have ran for a very long period of time as to how people view desert landscapes. The fact that you cannot imagine that a landscape which does not have much trees and just have grasses is home to so many animals. For people, because you don't see them so easily, they will think that, there isn't anything there. And therefore you need forests to have animals there. But it is not like that. So I think it goes back to a lot of these things which were already existing, the mindset of people, how it came in over a period of time, and it kind of still persists. And unless there is a recognition of the fact that these landscapes are equally important for biodiversity, then it's going to be very difficult to. And there has been a lot of articles that people have written a lot of studies that are there, which kind of shows the kind of biodiversity that exists in these landscapes. But even then, as of now, people still consider them to be the wastelands and not these kind of typical biodiverse habitats.
It sounds like we need more stories. You're talking about perceptions, more stories that tie those living organisms to the landscape, or even if they're just geophysical um, um, identity to that land, so that we can see it more than just a place where we cannot graze animals or we cannot harvest wood, but actually see the other life forms or living processes that exist in those desert landscapes. And I think this draws back to what we were talking about earlier about the stories that really brought your city life to life. And while we are talking about landscapes, you had sent me some images from your fieldwork. So I'm just going to share that right now so that we can all see what Chandrima is talking about. So tell us, Chandrima, a little bit about these landscapes. So this is where you were studying, was it the gerbils or?
No, this is Spiti. This is
Spiti?
where I did my master's work. I did not actually put in photographs of the place where I did my master's dissertation. This is where I did my PhD dissertation. So this was my field study area. And this is the general view of the landscape. This is at around 3,800 meters here from where the photo has been taken. The strip that you see running through the middle is the Spiti River, which is like a streak right now because this photo was taken in December. And by the time it's like May and August, July and August, this river is like flowing, and the entire river is filled with water from the melting of the snows. This is a common pasture that you see in these landscapes. These are the places where people graze their livestock. This is a pasture area which is called Mermuthang, and it's a very common place where the people in Khyber used to keep their yaks free ranging. So many a times they would have to come to this place to get their yaks back to the village. So this is a very common pasture habitat in Spiti.
And is that actually someone's house or is that just a shelter?
So that house, they say that it was built for the Dalai Lama. It's just been there. And I don't know if Dalai Lama had come to stay in that place. I'm not sure about that, but the house was made in his name. So this is Khyber, and this is the village where I stayed for the duration of my PhD most of the time. And it's a very beautiful village at 4,200 meters. This is the main township called Kaza. This is where, which kind of houses this township called Kaza and another village called Rangrik houses almost 75% of the dog population within the Upper Spiti landscape. So these are places where there's lots of tourists, people come, and there's a lot of places for people to stay. So this is a picture taken in Khyber. So this donkey was killed by a pack of dogs, and the remnants are being eaten by the rest of them. And this was just outside the village area. So this kind of shows the problem of livestock depredation in a landscape like Spiti. So I put this photograph to kind of show the kind of relationship that people have with dogs. So if you look at the fact that dogs are an important threat for livestock, even then, the kind of relationships that people share with dogs, it's very different. So this in some way shows that. This is a photo from the sterilization camp, one of the sterilization camps in 2013 that was conducted and this is in Kaza. So,
and how many dogs were sterilized, and how many villages were part of this sterilization campaign?
So the first sterilization campaign happened in like 2 to 3 villages. Kaza was the main one because that had the highest number of dogs, and almost the entire village of Kaza participated in that because the Pradhan was very the village pradhan was extremely active, that and he wanted that everybody wanted and he wanted everybody to kind of participate in this and get their dogs to be sterilized in during this when this camp was organized. So this particular camp happened in 2013 October, and there was another camp that took place in 2014 in the months of June, July. That was done in three or four other villages. This is a photo of me and my daughter. This is we were going to this village called Chicham, and this is something which in the local terms was known as the helicopter. So basically, it's like a small carriage that goes across a gorge. Thankfully, this carriage is not there now, and very recently there was a bridge that was built over it. But for 14 years, people moved back and forth on this carriage, and it was the way that I traveled to Chichim with my daughter. And initially I was kind of quite petrified, but then I think the people who were with me kind of gave me that assurance that no, we are there, it's okay, we can manage.
So yes, it's a good segue into the other part that was happening, the other stuff that was happening while you were in Spiti doing your research, and that you were also raising your child, Kuhu.
Yes.
She was with you in the field, and I have heard some stories that are more than just traveling on the helicopter, as you say. Tell us, what was the experience like being a mom and a scientist out in that kind of environment doing field work?
I think my life changed with my daughter coming in during my PhD, and it's still very challenging many a times. But the thing is, for me, it was also a very memorable experience to be with her in field. My PhD objectives actually changed because I had to do field work with a kid, and therefore my earlier work was actually looking into more of the relationship from looking at the relationship between dogs and red foxes within the landscape. So I was supposed to look at how dogs were affecting wildlife in Upper Spiti landscape. And then when my daughter was born, my advisor kind of said that, Chandrima, I don't think this kind of in very extensive fieldwork will be possible with you and Kuhu in field. So you will have to think of possibilities of objectives which you can work out in a place like Spiti when you're doing fieldwork with your daughter. So that's how my work became more dog-centric. And my PhD objectives changed because my daughter came in with me to field also because of that. And when I took her, she was one. She was one when she was with me in field. She stayed, the first 6-7 months that we stayed there, she was still being breastfed. So I was completely I was exhausted. I was sleep deprived, and she was teething. She was completely on this Zomo milk. I don't know whether you've heard about the Zomo. It's if you've seen in Nepal also, it's a cross between the yak and the cow, and their milk is supposed to be really high in fat. And she was not eating anything for these time periods, like say for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, where she would be just teething, not feel like eating anything. So she would be sustaining only on the milk of that animal 3 times in a day. So, and it was a different experience altogether. And the kind of things that she picked up, she started talking, she started identifying animals, livestock species in the village. She was one of those few kids who was put on a Chumurti horse, and all those kind of things. She had all those experiences. She danced to Spiti music. She learned how to imitate a donkey braying. So these were all the experiences that I had when I took her to field. It was very challenging, but it was equally memorable for me, because I think I realized that as a kid, I don't think I had that kind of an experience where I would be exposed to an environment like this. So I was happy that I was able to give that to her in some ways.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that when you were growing up, you had stories.
Yeah, I had stories, and she literally was within that. Yeah.
And it
But
also, sorry.
yeah, but there were also other concerns that I had, like doing a field work at that altitude. I had to make sure that she doesn't miss her vaccination dates, because those were the kind of logistic issues that I had to deal with. So I had to time my field work at a time when, you know, she was not supposed to get vaccinations. Those were the things that I had to look into a lot when I was doing my field work. Yeah.
So it sounds like your supervisor was supportive in the sense that he allowed the project to be flexible, to change the objectives in order to accommodate certain field limitations. What other support did you receive that enabled you to continue your research in the field?
So yeah, I think my supervisor Abhi was just simply fantastic that way. Very, very flexible. I didn't have to report to him when I was back in Bangalore. He kind of completely understood the fact that, you know, I was handling everything by myself, and therefore he just told me that, you know, as long as work gets done, that is the most important thing. It doesn't matter from where you work, whether you work from home, whether you work from office, it doesn't matter. Only if there is anything important, if there is a meeting, if there is something, some administrative things that you need to take care of and you have to be in office, then that's okay. But I was never, like, I didn't have to report to him on a daily basis or anything like that. So that kind of flexibility which I got from him, and also the fact that, you know, he gave me that ample flexibility to choose from the ideas that I brought in, and he kind of pitched in that, okay, maybe this is possible, maybe this is not possible. So I think that was the whole range. And even my co-advisor, for that matter, Yashveer Bhatnagar, I mean, they both have been extremely flexible and supportive during my entire PhD. And I'm really thankful for that, because I think you really need a supportive supervisor to do this kind of work. Without that, you won't be going anywhere. And of course, I think the most important thing for me was, as a single mother raising my kid in a situation like this, uh, I think the support systems that I built was incredible. The lady who looked after my daughter, and I'm forever thankful to her for whatever she did for these so many years. You know, because I could go to work, I could work peacefully because she was looking after my daughter, and I didn't have to worry about anything in
So
that.
where was this lady and how did you find her? She was in Spiti?
No. So in Spiti, when I was in Spiti, the local people kind of, they were there. There were people who looked after her. But then, you know, it's an entire village that is there looking out for you. I don't even remember a single moment in which I felt that, you know, I didn't have any help in the village when I was in field. I never had to buy milk ever for my daughter. Every day, every single day, one person from the village would come with a mug of milk and say, "This is for the Nomo. Nomo is a baby in Spiti." And I don't think she ever ran out of warm clothes also, because every week somebody would come in knitting some socks for her, knitting a sweater. And you know, these are very small things, but they really made me feel and cherish all these people who kind of helped me in this entire journey. Like, you know, there's an African proverb that kind of says, it takes a village to raise a child. And that was exactly so for my daughter. I think the whole village was there to help me raise her. So I think that was amazing. So that was Pity. But then when I was back in Bangalore, when I kind of finished up, or when I was during interim periods, like I would go to field, come back, again go to field. So during the interim times when I was in Bangalore, obviously I had to resort to, you know, a kind of facility where she would be there staying throughout the day, and I would be going to work. So all those things were there. So at that point of time, the person um, who used to go to, actually, he was also the same person who looked after my supervisor's son. And he kind of put me in through her and said, like, you know, just ask her, you know, let Kuhu be taken care by her. She's really nice. And unless you find a space in which you are able to work and she is also safe, you won't be able to get going with this. So I think, yeah. So that's how the lady Parimala came into our lives, and she's still there. She's like family. Like every week we talk to her almost
Oh, that's
after
lovely.
coming to Hyderabad.
Okay.
So I think, yeah, so those, and of course my friends, I had an incredible support system of friends, my PhD batchmates, my MSc, people from my MSc days whom I've known for the last 17 years, very thick friends, all have been there for me whenever I wanted them. They have babysat my daughter. They have taken care of her when I have been away. They have cooked for me when I have been sick. They have come and helped me set up my home. I don't think I ever missed the fact that I did not have one person in my life for which from whom I did not get help.
It sounds like you had
I think that
fantastic.
When you don't have somebody else, you have some mechanism to compensate for that. So I think that's exactly what happened with me.
So it sounds like you had a fantastic support network, family, friends, your institution supported you.
Yes.
You are also super tenacious and to persevere in spite of everything and push on ahead with your PhD in the fieldwork and being a mother in the field. But really you also did this. I'm curious, what did you hope that you have? Was there anything that any kind of support that you felt you wanted and needed but could not access?
There were times when I felt, as a PhD student, I think we spend a lot of our time, trying to network, meeting people, going to conferences. That is something that I really, had to kind of think a lot about. I just couldn't take her. First of all, most conferences are not child friendly. There were very few conferences which are child friendly. And there have been times when, I had to give up an international travel grant to not being able to go to a conference because I landed up with passport issues with my daughter. And so these are the kind of small things during which I feel that perhaps the presence of another person would have helped. But as I said, it really doesn't matter, in the sense when you don't have something else compensates for that. So, and I've also learned to take it in stride that, you have to make certain choices. You can't keep regrets of not being able to do certain things in your life. You have to make that conscious choice, because personally, I don't believe in sacrifices. I will not sacrifice anything like that. I will make a conscious choice of what I want to do and what I don't want to do. And it's all about that. It's about making these conscious choices as to how you can make the best of what you've got. So there are times when I do feel that, yes, maybe if I had gone to this conference, presented my work, I would have, met a different network of people. I would have been able to interact, maybe land up with some other opportunity or whatever. But then, as I said, I have learned to take things in that stride as well. So,
Chandrima, we have a question here from Savuj from Hyderabad. And he was wondering about the challenges that you may have encountered working with wildlife and some of the domestic dogs. How was the contrast between working with those two different types of animals? I think the wildlife is quite a nice variety of wildlife you have worked with. So maybe you can share with us a little bit of the different experiences that you've had with the wildlife.
Yeah, so for my master's dissertation in Gujarat, I worked on the ecology of Indian foxes. Basically, I was looking at their diets. And as a part of that work, I was also looking at gerbils, because gerbils formed an important part of the diet. And I think it's a different experience to work with wildlife, because you have that thing in you that you may not see this animal often. The fact that when you look at an Indian fox, it's not you sight an Indian fox every day. So when you look at an Indian fox, I think there's a sense of excitement that is always there when you work with wildlife. Whereas I guess for dogs, I'm not sure whether that sense of excitement was there in seeing a dog. Yes, I would be happy seeing a dog, but I think the other nuances of seeing a dog was much more exciting. Like there's this particular dog which I used to observe in Kibber. It used to go to one village and it used to take 10 days to come back to the same village. So every 10 days I would see this dog traveling back to this village. And those were the kind of things that I actually enjoyed So those are the differences that I can say, that when you're working with wild species, there is always an excitement of observing them in wild and things like that. For the dogs, it was very different. It was not like observing them, but it was observing different behaviors of them, which kind of was more exciting.
Yeah, I think that is unexpected, right? In that we look at domestic dogs thinking, that they're just these companion animals, or they could be working animals but then suddenly in the wilderness, you get to see them exercising choices because they're free to roam around and they're making decisions. They are going for long wanders. I think I had similar experience too, where we went to 3 different villages that were about 20 kilometers apart, and then we saw the same dog. And then that was a revealing, because we would learn that some people thought that it was a stray dog, but then it actually belonged to a yak herder who had returned from the pasture land, and so he was just letting the dog run around. And that also taught us a little bit about the perceptions that people had of what were free roaming dogs, but actually feral or stray dogs, but they actually turned out to be dogs that were roaming around. Now, since we're on the topic of dogs, and you had that image earlier of the dog that had killed a donkey, I'm just curious, that happened in the middle of a village. Is that correct, in the village?
So, yeah, just in the outskirts of, like, near the agricultural fields of the village.
And was there a human intervention when the dogs were trying to attack that donkey, or was it all over too soon?
No. So it just so happened that so in Spiti, what happens is the local communities, they herd their livestock on a daily basis, especially the small-bodied and the medium-bodied livestock. The large-bodied livestock like horses and yaks, they are kept free roaming in many of these pastures throughout the year, and only during certain festivities, in certain cultural occasions, these animals are brought to the village because they are of cultural importance for the people. So the villagers, they herd these livestock daily in and get them back to the village in the evening. So what happened was, this donkey happened to stray, and it got lost, and that's how it came to be killed by the pack of dogs.
On that note, dog predation, your research found, and this was really quite stunning, that you accounted on the economic costs of dog predation on livestock, and you found that the economic losses due to dogs were as much, if not more, than livestock losses due to native predators such as snow leopards. Yes. I'm curious about a few things. One, I was thinking about compensation, because that happens in Nepal too. If dogs are the ones that are responsible for livestock, people don't get compensation. I'm also wondering, do the dogs attack native predators? Did you manage to document anything about that?
So I have heard about stories of dogs chasing snow leopards in the landscape. A couple of people have also mentioned that to me, but I have not personally seen dogs chasing them, because I've never seen a snow leopard all those 3 years that I was in Spiti. I happened to miss one sighting of it, and after that I've never seen it. But I have personally seen dogs chasing ibex herds, and I have also heard from the local communities how during winters, when there is very heavy snow and the livestock is not going to the pastures anymore, so the dogs, they actually run after bharal or the blue sheep, and they kind of kill blue sheep during peak winters as well, when they don't have enough food from the livestock. So livestock forms a very important part of the diet of these free ranging dogs that keep hunting, that keep moving around in the pastures. And the thing is, if you look at some of these dogs, I mean, we call them as feral, but true feral really doesn't exist. They have some connection with humans at some point. Either they will be coming back to these villages, surviving on some scraps that people have thrown, and again they will be going to the pastures, hunting and coming back. So it's like a cycle. So I have heard of stories where people have mentioned that they do go after native predators as well. I am a little unsure about wolves. In general, wolves are in very low densities within that landscape. And if you look at in general, the way wolves have been perceived all across the globe, they are kind of persecuted all over. So even in Spiti, people have more negative attitudes towards wolves as compared to snow leopards also. So I'm not very sure about whether dogs have chased wolves in the landscape or not, but definitely I've heard of them chasing snow leopards.
So it sounds like encounter might be an effect of just density in that area, just like the way dogs attack more livestock if there's more livestock.
Yes.
That kind of relationship. So we also know that dogs attack people. So dogs attack people, they attack livestock, they attack wildlife. They also pose a disease threat like rabies in India and Nepal. Despite all of this, I think I've learned from your research, 60 million dogs are in India. 60 million. Yes. That is like 10 dogs for every person in Singapore. What is holding us back, you think, from dealing with the dog problem?
I think one of the major thing is the sheer number that we are talking about. You know, I think it's a huge number to even think of trying to control them, say like even in 10 years time. I mean, it took them, I mean, if you look at, and there's a lot of speculation in India as to how dog populations kind of grew. So there is no scientific information regarding dog populations. Okay, nobody really looked at dog demography or things like that in a sustained manner. There is some information that is available in pockets of some of the studies that have been done in India as to how, you know, what is the kind of sterilization and how that affects dog population and things like that. Like in the sense the dog health, basically how sterilization affects dog health and things like that. But there has been no studies that have really said that how sterilization can actually help in controlling dog populations within India.
Well, maybe it requires a multi-pronged approach. Your study sort of found some relationship with presence and abundance of food subsidies that led to population explosion of dogs. So that, of course, your research was based in a rural environment. Perhaps some of those, I mean, in the cities, it's compounded, right? I mean, it's also there's so many different aspects working together in cities and in city environment. You could have people immigrating with new dogs, or dogs immigrating too because of access to food resources. What about people's attitudes towards dogs? How does that affect, in your experience and in the communities that you have worked with? How do people's attitudes affect how they respond and manage dogs?
So if I look at, say, Spiti, at least for me, I was trying, I mean, as mentioned earlier, a large part of my PhD actually tried to understand some of these relationships, the human-dog relationships, especially in the context of an emerging problem of livestock depredation. So I also wanted to understand how people feel about dogs, especially when they're losing their own livestock and there's such heavy economic losses because of dogs, for which they are not compensated. It was surprising that in general, the people still had a very neutral attitude towards dogs, but I could see that there were differences. There were gender-based differences where the women fostered more negative attitudes towards dogs than men. And probably one of the reasons for that could be that the women are more intricately associated with the day-to-day handling of livestock within the landscape, more than the men. They are the ones who tend to them. They are the ones who feed them. And although the men may be going and herding these livestock within these pastures, when they come back home or when the livestock is in their shelter, it is basically the women who tend to them or help them when they are, giving birth to young ones and things like that. So the kind of association that women have with the livestock, probably in some ways when they lose these animals to dogs, kind of uh, it shows that the negative attitudes could be because of that.
So let me see if I get that. So women experience, are they experiencing more fear and stress in terms of suffering the burden of economic losses by not being able to guard livestock against dog predation, and also themselves fearing being attacked by dogs? Is that what you mean?
So I think of this itself is like a full-fledged study. But in general, if you look at some of the literature that exists for human wildlife conflict, there is something called the hidden costs, and a lot of these hidden costs of conflict are actually borne by the women folk in a landscape. So there could be many things. I mean, my study that didn't particularly look into that aspect, but overall it kind of coincides with what one of my other colleagues also found when he looked at attitudes towards native carnivores within the landscape, where women had more negative attitudes towards native carnivores than men as well. So it kind of coincided, kind of supported that thing as well.
One of the things that I found really interesting about your study, because you were explaining how the Spiti region opened up to agroforestry and cash crops and tourism, sounds almost like what is very similar to what's happening in my field site in the Annapurna conservation area. Going back to what you mentioned about the abundance of food subsidies in the form of garbage emerged in the landscape, dog populations exploded. Was this particular relationship between the abundance of food subsidies and dog abundance, was this communicated to local communities? How did they respond to it? Did they understand that relationship?
So I think the local communities, in some ways, they kind of understood that dog populations were increasing. Uh, why they were increasing? Yes, garbage was one of the reasons. But then when I had asked them about some of the local, what the dog population say like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, can you tell me something about it? I mean, they told me that 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have so many dogs in the landscape. Probably there was a mechanism of doing this strychnine poisoning to kill off the dogs which were old and which were like maimed or something like that. So you kind of wean out that population of dogs which would not be able to live. And that happened for quite some time, till about say like early 2000, or in the middle of around 2004-5, when all these things kind of stopped. And probably that was also, so 2001 was also the time when the animal birth control rules kind of came into India, and ABC was propagated as the only method of controlling dog populations. So in the sense, the people knew that the dog populations were increasing, and they usually had an idea that, okay, garbage could be one of the reasons. But I mean, for them, it was more about the problem that they were facing. But in terms of controlling garbage, yes, I don't think that came in much later. The fact that garbage need to be controlled within the landscape in order to, as one of the measures to bring about a controlled population for the dogs, that happened much later.
So we have some questions here. Thank you, Chandrima. Very quickly, Arati is asking if you have a link to learn more about hidden costs, or is there something that you would like to elaborate now about the hidden costs with regards to the gender relationship with not just dogs, I guess. I don't think Arati is specifically thinking about dogs, but just the because of their relationship with gathering resources, looking after livestock and all that. Do you want to elaborate on that now a little bit?
So I think there's a very important paper by Man Barua, which was published in 2013, and that was one of the very important papers in this particular context of human wildlife conflict, which actually spoke about it in detail. So, and there has also been a few subsequent papers after that. And a lot of the stuff that I have been talking about hidden cost is basically from the literature that I have read up. before taking this study up. But then understanding hidden costs within the landscape, as I said, is like a separate study in itself. That is basically getting into more into the nuances of understanding the human wildlife conflict, the kind of associations that people have with animals, how well dogs fit within the frame of hidden costs is something which I don't know, because a lot of the studies that have looked at these comes from wild carnivores or wild predators. But I presume it should not be too different, because the dog is acting as similar to a wild predator within the landscape here itself.
Yeah, dogs. The role of dogs sometimes have already superseded the role of native predators in terms of attacking and even affecting the entire trophic level. Other predators, mesopredators as well. We have another question here from Meenakshi from Hyderabad. She would like to know, so dogs are, from her knowledge, dogs are a major scavenger of waste, which is a huge problem in India. I think that the major reason for their thriving on the streets is because of the prevalence of waste. Plus, in a developing country, India has other major issues to deal with, like poverty, diseases, nutrition, etc. How do you think you as an ecologist may be able to persuade the government to invest in controlling dogs? She mentions here sterilization, but maybe you have other things to comment on.
I think it's a very good question, but it's a very tough question to answer also. And all I can say is that, as I mentioned earlier, we do not have evidence in terms of how dog demography has changed in India. We only know that it has increased. There is a speculation that when the vulture population decline happened because of diclofenac, dogs filled in that niche of the scavengers. And that's how people have the idea of dogs being scavengers for garbage. But they kind of filled in that niche because the vultures were not there. And that's how their population is speculated to increase. But there is no data. Nobody has collected any information before 2000 and post the vulture decline as to how dogs have changed within the landscape. I mean, I have literally tried to run into as much of information as possible to just kind of get an idea as to what are the dog populations in India that has changed. And the only references that I had was one Menezes paper in 2008, which kind of said 25 million at that point in time. And then the next value that came to me was the book, which kind of talks about dogs and wildlife conservation by Matthew Gomper, which looked at human-dog ratios and came up with an estimate for dog populations in India. And we are the fourth largest. 60 million, we are the fourth largest dog population in India. So the thing is that the whole idea that dogs are scavengers, yes, they may be scavengers, but they kind of filled up the niche for because one species went down in their number.
Yeah, I think also what's interesting, what I'm getting from what you're saying is that you're really trying to find an ecological solution to controlling the population. Back in the day, well, so Singapore used to have a dog population in the 70s and 80s. They tried culls, they didn't work. And like you said, there's a lag between getting the data, actually trying to understand what is happening, right? You can't just keep sweeping up. I mean, to just use a metaphor, right? You're just sort of sweeping up the population, but then it keeps coming back. You're not actually dealing with the main problem. And until you've done a study, you can't do that.
It's like, it's like, as my advisor also rightly says, it's like trying to control by keeping the tap open. If you have your tap open and you have, and the trickle that comes out, how will you control it if your tap is open? And that's a very good analogy that he gives, that you're trying to control something with the tap open.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is exactly that. The dog populations in India is exactly that. We are trying to control it. I mean, we have no information about how dog populations grew even after vulture decline happened. Like, did they take 4 years? Did they take 5 years? Did they take 8 years to even reach to the level that they have reached right now. And at this stage of 60 million in India, can we kind of just have it like this and say it'll just vanish like that? It won't. It has taken that many years to build up to this. And therefore reducing it to a level where, you know, where things, you don't see the kind of things that is happening right now, is not going to happen in a jiffy. It's going to take a while, and it's going to take a while because people have to understand the problems that we have with dogs in a landscape across. So my first chapter of my thesis basically tries to unpack the dog wildlife interactions in India. And this is perhaps the first set of information that has come out from my study across the range in India to see what are the kind of impacts that dogs are having on wildlife. That information was not available till this date for at a subcontinent level. So the thing is that it is very important to understand what are the kind of impacts that we are talking about. Most people are not aware of these impacts.
So we're into an hour. So I'm just going to wrap up. We take one last question, Arati's question about the army. And I think that, well, for me at least, that links back a bit to the working with a tap open analogy. Was the presence of army camps increased the subsidies and exploded the dog population? Has there been an effort to work with the army to control this? And what response have you received from the army? This is a great question. I'm curious about that too, because when we were working in central Himalaya in Nepal as well, we did work with the army. So I'm very curious to see what your experience was like in Ladakh. Well, sorry, not in Ladakh, but with the army.
So in Spiti, the area where I work, the nearest army camp, proper army camp was in Sumdo. That is like really far away from the landscape where I worked. And about a few years ago, there used to be this SSB, the Sahastra Seema Bal, which used to be based in Kaza and somewhere close by. But I think their base was also kind of taken off. So we don't have any army camps around the Upper Spiti landscape in the place where I worked. So the nearest army camp was in Sumdo. And I do remember that when I was coming back after finishing my field work, there were some conversations that was going on with some of these people regarding, managing waste and things like that. But in and around the place where I worked, there were no army camps. It was mostly the garbage, the waste that was generated through the tourism thing, and a lot of people coming into the landscape. There's been an infrastructure that has been set up to increase tourism within the landscape, and it was mostly for that. And Kaza is the main township where there are lots of dogs. That's also the tourist hub of that place.
If I may just share, our experience of working with the army in Nepal, one of the challenges was that, so they do a lot of exercises around the landscape, and sometimes they find a really beautiful Tibetan Mastiff or mountain dog, and they're taken in. And when we were trying to work with them, one of our challenges was convincing them to sterilize those so-called beautiful dogs, because those dogs have litters. They are very fecund. They have like 2 litters, yes, up to 7 to 8 puppies. Often the survival is very good for the puppies. So that's 20 dogs added to the landscape every year. And that was one of the challenges was that, and we were talking about attitudes, right? So there are some dogs people are more willing to sterilize or get rid of. And then there are some dogs that they don't want to sterilize. And when it comes to managing the dog population, you actually can't really have that. You can't have an animal that is reproducing. And also, unless there's some kind of ratio that you've actually managed to achieve to maintain a stable population. But often that is not the case happening in these kind of landscapes. And I think this goes back to the need for the different groups of people, the different stakeholders in this landscape, to be working together to see things through the same lens and want to have the same outcome, and they have to work in concert. one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Chandrima, was that the challenge of maintaining sterilization camps that were frequent enough to actually
Yes.
stabilize the population. So that's a challenge. Funding is a challenge because it is an expensive endeavor. In Nepal, one of the challenges is that sometimes the dogs that are sterilized with much effort and cost end up getting culled, and that doesn't work either. So you need the community to not cull the dogs. For the people who are subsidizing the sterilization to maintain that over a sufficient period of time. You were going to say something?
Yeah, so I feel that I think the thing is, it's not about you should not cull the dogs. I mean, there are cases when you really need to put in a human way of putting them down, and
Right,
I
and then
am
the
not
dogs are
against that.
sterilized.
So yeah, and my point is that it cannot be one single method of controlling a population. There has to be a multi-pronged effort. And the thing is, more importantly, people have to understand, as you said, that every stakeholder has to understand what is the final goal of what they want. Do they want a lower population of dogs? Do they want lower levels of depredation by livestock by dogs? I mean, the common goal is very important. And if you look at some of the landscapes within India, I'm not just talking about Spiti, but if you look at, say, the protected areas in India for that matter, every nook and corner of protected area is surrounded by villages. You have a lot of dogs getting into these protected areas. There are critically endangered species like the great Indian bustards. If you look at the semi-arid areas and things like that, already the bustards have gone through a massive population decline. And then you have this last nail on the coffin. It's like the last nail on the coffin where the dogs are going and killing great Indian bustards. What do you do with these dogs? Do you allow them to live in that landscape, or would you physically take them out from the landscape? I think one of the major issues in controlling dog populations is the fact that the social, the cultural, the political, all these things have to come together. That doesn't happen so easily. It's very, very difficult to make people understand that dogs are not to be there on the streets. You have to take them home. We emulate the West in terms of our consumeristic patterns, but we do not emulate the West when it comes to dog ownership policies. If you look at US, if you look at UK, if you look at Norway, you look at any of the European countries, would you see any free-ranging dogs outside? You won't. So I think those are the kind of things. Everything has to work in a tandem, which is difficult in a place like India. You need strict dog ownership policies. If you look at, say, for example, even in Nepal, the landscape where you worked, dogs would be moving across households. The strict ownership of a dog being a pet and only associated with one household doesn't happen. In India, even if you have dogs, the dog is free roaming. Even a pet dog is free roaming. How many pet dogs are leashed? It's only probably in cities that you will find it. So it's a combination of different things. One method is not going to give a solution to this problem.
And that's why your work is so important. I hope you managed to publish some of the very interesting papers that I know that you have on your desk right now that just need to get out there to feed information into this problem that really needs to be solved. It is a issue of human well-being, of wildlife conservation, of landscape conservation. It's really fantastic how what seems like a very simple animal, domestic dog, is actually bringing all of these issues together, and also will require all the stakeholders to come together for a multi-pronged approach. And what is interesting also is not a problem that is unique to India or South Asia. Many Latin American countries suffering surprisingly same
similar.
Yeah, conflicts with dog, wildlife, livestock, people. It's a really a challenging problem, and I think it's as complex as we humans are. The way we all perceive things so differently, and we want to.
I mean, you will hear similar stories from Chile, from Brazil. If you look at many of these South American countries, you will hear the similar stories, how they have been interacting with wildlife. There's a lot of literature that is actually from there, which helped me build up my base for the work that I did in India, because when I started off, there wasn't anything available other than my supervisor's PhD study in Maharashtra and one more study which looked at diseases. There weren't any more studies on which I could base my my hypothesis that I had as to what things would be happening. So I think a lot of the work came from these areas, which kind of helped me build up on my work. And now from this work, people can take it further.
Yeah, Chile is a very interesting context with that the dogs are actually protected even within the national park, so they cannot be removed.
Yes.
And I think they can't be sterilized either. I'm not entirely sure about the law in there, but the dogs in the national park actually have the same protection as the wildlife, which is
which is very weird.
Bizarre. Which is and they are attacking, just like you said, every imaginable life form, from birds to aquatic animals like seals and sea lions, large ungulates like the huemul, and I'm sure like in you have your black buck in India, amongst many other vulnerable and endangered animals that need protection from these domestic animals. So thank you everyone so much for all your questions. I really get a sense that the conversation is still very warm and hot. It has been very good talking to you today. Chandrima, thank you for preparing those images to bring us a little glimpse into the landscape which you spent so many years in together with your daughter. And thank you all for participating with your questions and making this chat more lively. Next Thursday, please join me again for another live session with ecologist, sociologist, and National Geographic Explorer Julia Van Velden from South Africa. She will share insights into helping find a balance between development and the environment when it comes to the bushmeat trade in Malawi, where she spent several years doing research. We will also talk a little bit about saving pigeons in Mauritius, which is what Julia was involved with. Again, thank you very much, Chandrima, for joining me today. And I'm really glad that the internet connection held up.
Yeah, we didn't have any technical glitches.
Yeah, so perfect.
My fears didn't come true.
Yeah. Murphy's Law, the other way around. You can all stay connected with Chandrima and I'm about to drop some links into the chat so that we can all continue to keep the conversation going. I understand some of you may want some links from Chandrima to find out more about her work, so look her up on Twitter and get in touch. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care. And look out for the video on YouTube, and you can share it with your friends. Thank you, everyone. Take care and stay safe. Bye.
You too. Bye.